My sister's bridal shower was on a Saturday in late April, and I remember the centerpieces were made of white peonies and eucalyptus, and the ribbon on each chair was tied in a perfect bow, and the whole thing had cost more than I made in a month. I sat at that table in a yellow dress I'd bought on clearance and smiled until my face hurt, and I thought, this is fine. This is normal. Families do things like this. I thought that for almost 2 years. I was wrong about almost all of it. Welcome back to Ravage Stories, where secrets come out, betrayals get exposed, and the people who thought they'd get away with it never do. If you're new here, subscribe, join the family. You're going to want to be here for what comes next. Drop a comment where you are listening from. It means a lot to me. Now let's go. My name is Delia Marsh, and I grew up in a small town outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Not the suburbs, the actual rural edge, where the road turns to gravel about a mile past the Sunoco station and the neighbor's property line is marked by a broken fence post that's been broken since 1987. My parents, Carl and Ruth Marsh, owned about 4 acres of land and a house they'd bought in 1989 for $82,000. My father worked for the county highway department for 31 years. My mother cleaned houses 3 days a week until her knees gave out, and then she answered phones for a chiropractor's office for another decade after that. They were not wealthy people. They were the kind of people who kept the heat at 62 degrees in winter and wore layers indoors and never once complained about it, because that was just how you managed. My mother kept a coupon binder. My father resold his work boots twice before replacing them. When I say working class, I mean working class. I mean the genuine article, not a story told about it from the outside. I am the older daughter. My sister Vanessa is 4 years younger than me. We were close enough growing up, shared a room until I was 12, fought over the television, that kind of thing. But even then, if I'm being honest with you, there was always a tilt to the way things worked in our house. Vanessa was the pretty one, the easy one, the one who made my parents laugh at the dinner table. I was the one who got good grades and kept to herself and caused no trouble, which, as it turns out, is a role that earns a certain kind of invisible respect but very little in the way of warmth. I left for college at 18 on a partial scholarship and worked 2 jobs to close the gap. I graduated with a degree in accounting, moved to an apartment in Harrisburg proper, and built something slow and steady and real. By the time I was 36, I had a decent salary at a mid-sized firm, a small retirement account, and a carefully tended savings fund I'd been growing for 4 years toward a down payment on a house. I want you to understand what that savings fund meant. I ate lunch at my desk 5 days a week. I drove a 2014 Honda Civic with a cracked dashboard. I kept a spreadsheet, not a budget app, an actual spreadsheet that I updated every Sunday night. I was 36 years old, and I had saved $41,000, and I needed $50,000 to close on the kind of house I could actually afford, a 3-bedroom on a quarter acre in a neighborhood that wasn't glamorous but was solid and quiet and mine. In the fall of that year, I sat down with my parents at their kitchen table and asked if they could loan me $9,000 to close the gap. Not a gift, a loan. I had a repayment schedule typed up and printed. My father looked at the paper and then looked at my mother, and my mother put her hand over mine and said they were so sorry, they just couldn't do it right now. Things were tight. There were some expenses they hadn't anticipated. They just didn't have it. My father nodded the whole time she talked, like a man confirming testimony. I folded the repayment schedule and put it back in my bag. I told them I understood. I drove home and I sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment building for 22 minutes before going inside. I want to tell you about the morning I found out, because the way you find out something like this matters. It stays with you in a specific physical way, not just the information, but the texture of the moment. It was a Tuesday, February, one of those Pennsylvania Februaries that feels like the world has forgotten what color looks like. Everything gray, the fields flat, the sky pressing down low. I was at my desk at the firm, and my colleague Marcus, who did estate work and had a habit of forwarding things he thought were interesting, sent me a property transfer document he'd pulled as part of a research task. He sent it because one of the parcels in it shared a street name with a case we were working on. He sent it as a throwaway attachment. He had no idea what it meant to me. The document was a deed of trust, a second mortgage filed against a residential property in Dauphin County. The property address was my parents' house. The origination date was 11 months earlier. The loan amount was $62,000. I stared at that number for a long time. I printed the document and put it in a manila folder. That folder started in my desk drawer. I want you to remember that folder, because it's going to move. I didn't call my parents that day. I went home and opened my laptop and pulled the county property records, which are public. I pulled the mortgage filing, the lien history, the deed. I am an accountant. This is what I do. I follow numbers, and numbers do not lie. They just require translation. The second mortgage had been originated 11 months before the conversation at the kitchen table where my mother held my hand and told me they couldn't help. The draw on that loan was $62,000. Vanessa's wedding had been 7 months before that conversation. I sat with that timeline for a long time. I want to be careful here, because at this stage I still didn't know anything for certain. What I had was a document and a date and a sick feeling in my stomach that I kept trying to reason away. People take second mortgages for all kinds of reasons. Maybe there were medical bills. Maybe there were repairs to the house. I gave myself 3 days of benefit of the doubt, and then on a Thursday evening I drove to Harrisburg Public Records and pulled Vanessa's marriage license filing and the property records associated with the address she and her husband Kyle had bought 3 months after the wedding. Then I sat in the county records office under fluorescent lighting with my coat still on, and I did the math. The house Vanessa and Kyle bought had required a down payment. Their loan documents, which were attached to the deed, showed a conventional mortgage with a 20% down. The purchase price of the house was $248,000. 20% of that is $49,600. That is not $62,000, but $62,000 minus $49,600 is $12,400, and $12,400 is, very nearly, the approximate cost of the bridal shower with the white peonies and the perfectly tied chair bows that I had sat through in my clearance dress smiling until my face hurt. The folder moved from my desk drawer to my car that night. It rode in my trunk for the next 6 weeks. I did not confront my parents. I want you to understand why, because I think this is the part that some people struggle with. Why didn't you just ask them directly? The answer is because I'm an accountant, not a detective, and I had learned from 20 years of watching numbers tell stories that the person who moves first without a complete picture is the person who loses the room. I needed to know everything before I said anything, and I needed to know why, not just what they had done, but why they had decided that this was acceptable, that one daughter's wedding and house down payment was worth taking a second mortgage on the family home, while the other daughter sat in a parking lot for 22 minutes. I called my Aunt Patricia, my mother's younger sister, who lived 40 minutes away in Mechanicsburg and who had always been the family archivist, the one who kept track of what was said at what dinner and who had borrowed what from whom and why. Aunt Patricia and my mother had a complicated relationship that had been cool for about 6 years over something involving a piece of furniture from my grandmother's estate. I called her on a Sunday morning and asked if we could have coffee. We met at a diner on Route 11 that still served liver and onions as a lunch special and had vinyl booth seats the color of dried mustard. I told her what I'd found. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she set down her coffee cup and she said, "Your mother has been telling people Vanessa needed a fresh start." A fresh start. That phrase sat in my chest like a stone. Patricia told me what she knew, which was more than I'd expected. Apparently, the decision to fund Vanessa's down payment had not been spontaneous. It had been discussed, planned, and executed over the course of several months, and my parents had known for at least a year before that conversation at the kitchen table that they were going to do it. The second mortgage had been intentional. The timing of my request, arriving between the decision and the disbursement, had been, as my aunt put it, with an economy of words I still respect, inconvenient. There was no other savings. There was no emergency fund. There was just the house and the decision they'd made about who deserved what it could offer. I added Patricia's account to the folder. The folder moved from my trunk to a locked box in my closet. I want to tell you about Vanessa, because she is not, actually, the villain of this story, which is something that took me a long time to understand. Vanessa is my sister. She is 32 years old, and she married a man named Kyle Fenner, who works in sales and has a firm handshake and the kind of confidence that comes from never having had to wonder if there was enough. I do not think Vanessa orchestrated this. I think Vanessa had been raised to expect a certain kind of attention, and she accepted it the way you accept something you've always been handed, without examining whether it was fair, because fairness is a question you only start asking when you've been on the wrong side of it. What I think is that my parents made a choice, and the choice was Vanessa's comfort over Delia's, and Delia will manage, because Delia always manages. I am, in fact, very good at managing, but I want you to understand what it costs. The folder now held the deed of trust, the mortgage documents, Vanessa's purchase deed, 3 pages of my own financial calculations, and notes from my conversation with Patricia. I had begun, without fully naming it, building a case, not for a courtroom, at least not yet, but for myself. For the version of the conversation that I would eventually have to have, and for the version of that conversation where I would not be dismissed, sidelined, or told I was being dramatic. In March, 2 things happened in the same week. The first was that Vanessa called me to tell me she was pregnant, and my parents hosted a dinner to celebrate, and I sat at that same kitchen table and watched my mother hold Vanessa's hands with both of hers and say, "We'll do whatever we can," and I kept my expression level. The second thing was that I called a real estate attorney named Susan Cho, who practiced out of an office on Derry Street, and I told her what I had. Not everything, just the structure. The second mortgage, the disbursement, the timeline, the loan still outstanding. I asked her what, if any, legal exposure my parents might have. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Delia, this depends on a few things, but if they misrepresented their financial situation to obtain favorable terms on the loan and used those proceeds to benefit one beneficiary over another in a way that could constitute fraudulent conveyance under state law, that's not a small conversation. She also told me something else, that if the house was ultimately going to be part of any inheritance and assets had been deliberately depleted to favor one heir, there were grounds for an equitable distribution claim. She told me to keep documenting. I told her I already was. The folder moved to Susan Cho's office. Here's the part where I have to tell you about my father, because my father is not a cold man. My father is a man who worked 31 years for the county and coached my little league team badly, and who once drove 4 hours in a snowstorm to pick me up from a stranded car on the interstate and didn't say a single word about it afterward. He is not cruel. He is, I think, a man who made a decision under the influence of the woman he has been married to for 40 years, and who then held to that decision the way some men hold to things, not out of conviction, but out of an unwillingness to revisit it. I do not think he is innocent. I think his silence was its own kind of choice. I went to see my parents on a Sunday in April, exactly 1 year after the bridal shower, though I hadn't planned that. It's just how the calendar fell. I brought a lemon cake from a bakery downtown, which felt absurd in retrospect, but I was raised to bring something when you visit. We sat in the living room and my mother asked about work and I answered, and then I asked casually how things were going financially, whether the house expenses had settled down. My mother said things were fine, much better. They'd worked through the situation. My father was looking at the carpet. I said, "That's good. The second mortgage must have helped." The room went very still. My mother looked at my father looked at me, and then my mother said, in a voice that I can only describe as load-bearing, the voice of a woman holding up a version of events with both hands, that there had been some things they'd had to figure out privately, and they hadn't wanted to burden me. I said, "The $62,000 for Vanessa's house." My father put his face in his hands. What happened next lasted about 40 minutes. It was not loud. There was no shouting. That is not how my family operates. We are a family of silences and carefully worded evasions. What happened was a conversation in which my mother, over the course of those 40 minutes, moved through denial, partial acknowledgement, a lengthy explanation of Vanessa's circumstances, a pivot to what I had accomplished on my own, and finally something that was almost, but not quite, an apology. What she never did was say she was wrong. What she said, at the end, after the 40 minutes, was that she had done what she thought was best for the family. I want to tell you what I said in return, because it is the only line in this story that belongs completely to me. I said, I needed $9,000. I wasn't asking for charity. I had a repayment schedule. You let me sit at that table and told me you were broke. You had already signed the mortgage papers. My father started to say something. I looked at him. He stopped. I left the lemon cake on the counter. The following week, Susan Cho filed a civil complaint on my behalf. The legal theory was not complicated, though the emotional weight of it was enormous. Under Pennsylvania law, a transfer of assets from a parent to a child that depletes a jointly held or community property estate, particularly a mortgaged asset, in a way that disadvantages other heirs, can constitute fraudulent conveyance when the intent is demonstrably preferential. The second mortgage, drawn against the family home which was jointly held, had been used to fund a transfer to Vanessa that my parents had actively concealed from me, including through the affirmative misrepresentation that they lacked the financial means to assist me. That misrepresentation, paired with the documented timeline, gave us something real to work with. It was not a criminal matter. I want to be precise about that, because this is not a story about people going to prison. It was a civil matter about money, and about a paper trail that told the truth when the people involved would not. In June, Vanessa was served. I need to tell you about that day because it was one of the hardest days of this entire ordeal, and also the day I stopped second-guessing myself. She called me within the hour. She was crying. She kept saying she hadn't known I'd been refused, hadn't known the money had come from a second mortgage, hadn't known the timing of any of it. And the thing is, I believe her. I believe Vanessa did not know. What she had done was what she had always done, accepted what was offered without asking where it came from. That didn't make it legal. That didn't make it fair, but it mattered to me more than I expected it to hear her voice on the phone without a script. The mediation process took 4 months. I will compress it for you because the procedural details, while satisfying in a certain way, are less important than what they produced. What we established through documentation was the following. The second mortgage had been obtained in part through financial disclosures on the loan application that materially understated existing obligations, a detail that the lender, once notified, found significant. The transfer to Vanessa had been structured in a way that, once laid out in black and white, could not be characterized as anything other than a preferential disbursement from an asset my parents did not fully own free and clear. My parents' attorney, a man named Gerald Pruitt, who wore the same tie to every session and once, memorably, fell asleep for approximately 45 seconds during a document review and woke up without acknowledging it. Gerald Pruitt told my parents clearly that their exposure was real and that settling was advisable. They settled. The settlement amount was not $62,000 because that was not the ask. The ask, structured by Susan Cho with precise intention, was equitable remediation. What that meant in practice was that the sum transferred to Vanessa and Kyle, the $49,000 applied to their down payment, was formally recognized as an advancement against their inheritance, to be documented as such in an updated estate planning instrument. Additionally, my parents agreed to fund an equivalent advancement to me, $9,000 of which came from Vanessa and Kyle directly, at their offer, and the remainder structured as a formal documented loan from my parents against the same estate instrument with recording. It was not a perfect outcome. It was not poetic justice. It was the best available version of fairness applied retroactively to a situation that should not have required a civil filing to resolve. I closed on my house in September, 3-bedroom, quarter-acre, quiet street. The closing was on a Thursday afternoon, and it took about 90 minutes and involved an amount of paperwork that would have impressed me less 6 months earlier. Susan Cho came, my Aunt Patricia came, wearing a green dress I'd never seen before, and an expression of calm satisfaction that I will keep with me for the rest of my life. I signed my name 23 times. The house keys were handed to me in a small paper envelope. I drove to my parents' house that evening, not to celebrate and not to punish, just because that's where I come from, and because there are some things you carry with you even after they've hurt you, because they are yours. My father opened the door and we stood in the doorway for a moment, and he said he was glad for me. I said thank you. My mother was in the kitchen. I stayed for 40 minutes and I drove home to my own house. There are things I understand now that I didn't at the beginning of this. The first is that love and fairness are different things, and parents can hold both and still fail to distribute them equally. And that failure has a cost that doesn't disappear because no one meant to charge it. The second is that silence is not the same as consent, and when you go quiet in the face of an injustice you know is happening, you are making a choice as real as any other choice. My father was not a bad man. He was a quiet man who didn't interrupt, and that quiet cost me something real, and I want to name that precisely, not as accusation, but as accounting. The third thing is that documentation is not cruelty. Keeping a folder, hiring an attorney, filing a complaint, those are not acts of aggression. They are acts of self-preservation, and there is no apology required for preserving yourself. The fourth is this: the people who tell you to keep the peace are usually the people for whom the current arrangement is working. I still have the folder. It sits in the locked box in my closet at the house, which I have now lived in for nearly a year. The spare bedroom has a bookshelf I built myself from a flat-pack kit using a YouTube tutorial and a level and a Saturday afternoon, and it is not perfectly straight, but it is standing, and I like that about it. The crack in the kitchen ceiling that the inspector flagged has been patched. The yard has been raked. The front door is red, which I chose because I have always wanted a red front door, which is the smallest possible version of having exactly what you intended. I think about that kitchen table sometimes, the one at my parents' house where I sat with my repayment schedule printed and folded in my bag and was told by people who had already signed the papers for $62,000 that there was nothing available. I think about the 22 minutes in the parking lot. I think about how close I came to just accepting it, to absorbing it into the ongoing accounting of all the ways I had learned to manage and file and let pass. I didn't let it pass. I kept the folder. I found Susan Cho. I sat through 4 months of mediation with Gerald Pruitt and his sleeping tie, and I did not waver, and I came out of it with a house and a documented record and a version of the story that told the truth. That's what I want to leave you with. Not the settlement amount, not the legal mechanism, not even the red front door, although I do love the red front door. What I want to leave you with is this: when someone tells you there's nothing available, and later you find out there was always something available, just not for you, that is not a family misunderstanding. That is a choice someone made about your value, and you are allowed to respond to it. Here is what I want to ask you. If you had found those documents by accident, if Marcus had sent you that email, if the numbers had told you the story before anyone admitted to it, what would you have done? Would you have stayed quiet to keep the peace, or would you have opened the folder? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and I mean that. If this story hit you somewhere real, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the person who needs to hear it. I'll see you soon.